There are moments in life that seem ordinary when they happen, but later, when you finally understand the full story, you realize they were never ordinary at all. Last night was one of those moments. Something happened. Something your soulmate was not expecting to discover. Something that made them stop, look again, and suddenly connect pieces of the past that they had never been able to understand for so long. They may have wondered why certain things happened the way they did. They may have questioned your silence. They may have misunderstood your distance. They may have believed that when you disappeared, pulled away, stayed quiet, or refused to explain yourself, it meant that you did not care. But last night, they found evidence that changed the entire story. They discovered that what looked like distance may actually have been protection. What looked like silence may have been love expressed in a language they did not understand. What looked like indifference may have been someone quietly standing between them and something they never knew was coming. And now they cannot stop thinking about you. They are replaying memories. They are remembering conversations. They are looking at old situations from a completely different perspective. They are asking themselves questions they should have asked long ago. Why did they do that? Why did they disappear at that exact moment? Why did they refuse to tell me what was happening? Why did they make certain choices that seemed so confusing? And most importantly, were they protecting me all along? That is the question that has stayed with them, because last night, something clicked. One small piece of evidence led to another, a memory connected with another memory, a detail they had forgotten suddenly became important. A decision you made years ago suddenly looked different, and the more they thought about it, the harder it became for them to deny the possibility that you had been quietly looking out for them without asking for recognition, praise, or gratitude. You never needed them to know. That may be what makes this so powerful. You were not doing it for applause. You were not doing it so they would call you a hero. You were not keeping score. You simply did what you believed needed to be done, and somehow, last night, they discovered it. They found the missing piece. They found the evidence. And now their heart is processing something their mind may have resisted for a very long time. Maybe they remember the night you suddenly changed your behavior. Maybe they remember the conversation where you told them not to trust a certain situation. Maybe they remember how you encouraged them to walk away from something that seemed harmless. Maybe they remember a warning you gave them that they ignored. Maybe they remember the moment you accepted their anger instead of explaining yourself. At the time, they may have thought you were being difficult. They may have thought you were overreacting. They may even have thought you were trying to control the situation. But now they are looking backward, and the past looks different from here. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it is hidden inside an old message, an old note, a conversation someone finally remembers, a decision that suddenly makes sense, a piece of information that was overlooked, a person finally telling the truth, a forgotten detail resurfacing at exactly the right time. And sometimes, one tiny discovery is enough to make someone realize that the person they misunderstood most may have been the person who cared about them more deeply than they ever knew. That is what happened last night. Your soulmate may have sat there in silence for a while after discovering it. They may have stared at the evidence. They may have read something more than once. They may have questioned whether they were interpreting it correctly. Because accepting this truth means they also have to confront something uncomfortable. They may have judged you unfairly. They may have walked away too quickly. They may have assumed the worst. They may have believed that your silence meant you had stopped caring. They may have allowed pride, fear, confusion, or outside opinions to influence how they saw you. And now they are wondering whether they got the entire story wrong. Imagine realizing that the person you thought had abandoned you was actually trying to protect you from something you could not see. Imagine realizing that the person you thought was cold was actually carrying a burden silently. Imagine discovering that someone made a difficult choice because they believed it would keep you safe, even if it meant you would misunderstand them. That kind of realization can shake someone deeply, and your soulmate is feeling that shift right now. They are not simply thinking about what happened. They are thinking about you. They are remembering your face, your voice, your reactions, your patience, the things you said, the things you refused to say, the moments when you seemed to know something they did not, and suddenly, those moments have a different meaning. They are asking themselves whether you knew more than you ever revealed. They are wondering how long you had been carrying that secret. They are wondering whether you ever wanted to tell them. They are wondering why you chose to protect them instead, and somewhere inside that questioning, something else is happening. Their walls are beginning to come down, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly. Because truth has a way of changing the emotional meaning of memories. A moment that once felt painful can become understandable. A silence that once felt cruel can become complicated. A goodbye that once felt like rejection can become sacrifice. A distance that once felt like abandonment can become protection. And your soulmate is beginning to understand that. Maybe this is why you always felt difficult to forget. Maybe this is why, no matter how much time passed, something about you remained in their mind. Maybe this is why certain songs reminded them of you. Maybe this is why certain places brought back memories. Maybe this is why they occasionally wondered how you were doing. Even when they had no reason to, there are connections that do not disappear simply because people stop talking. There are memories that remain meaningful even when circumstances change. There are people who leave a mark on your life without realizing how deeply they did it, and sometimes, the truth arrives much later than the emotion. Last night may have been that moment for them. They discovered something that made them reconsider everything. And now they may be wondering whether they still have a chance to make things right. That question can be frightening, because reaching back towards someone requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that you were wrong. It requires admitting that you cared. It requires admitting that you were afraid. It requires risking rejection. And your soulmate may be struggling with all of that right now. They may want to reach out. They may have already thought about what they would say. They may have opened a message window and closed it again. They may have typed something and deleted it. They may have imagined your response. They may be wondering whether you would even want to hear from them. They may be afraid that too much time has passed. They may be afraid that you have moved on. They may be afraid that you no longer care, but underneath all of those fears is one powerful realization: they finally understand that your actions mattered. Not because they were perfect, not because everything between you was simple, not because there were no misunderstandings, but because they now see something they could not see before. You cared. Perhaps you cared quietly, perhaps you cared imperfectly, perhaps you cared from a distance, perhaps you cared in ways that were difficult to explain, but you cared, and that realization is difficult for them to ignore. There is something else they may have discovered last night. They may have realized that you were not trying to control their life. You were trying to give them a choice. You may have stepped back because you wanted them to make their own decisions. You may have refused to force them to believe you. You may have known that someday they would understand without being pushed, and now that day may finally be arriving. That is why the evidence matters. It does not simply prove one event, it changes the meaning of everything surrounding it. Suddenly, your patience looks different, your warnings look different, your silence looks different, your boundaries look different, your choices look different. Even the moments when you seemed emotionally distant may now appear in another light. Perhaps you were protecting your own heart while also protecting theirs. Perhaps you knew that forcing the truth would only create more confusion. Perhaps you understood that certain things had to unfold naturally. And maybe that is why you never demanded recognition. You simply continued forward. You let time reveal what you could not explain, and time has a strange way of exposing the truth. Last night, your soulmate may have experienced that truth firsthand. They may have felt an unexpected wave of emotion: relief, regret, warmth, sadness, hope, maybe even disbelief. Because when someone realizes they misunderstood a person who mattered to them, the emotions rarely arrive one at a time. They come together. One memory triggers another, one realization creates another question, one answer opens another door, and suddenly, the person who had been trying to move forward is looking backward again. Not because they want to live in the past, but because they finally understand that the past contained information they were missing. Your soulmate may now be thinking about the choices they made. They may be wondering whether things could have been different. They may be asking whether they pushed you away, whether they listened to the wrong people, whether they allowed fear to speak louder than their feelings, whether they confused protection with rejection, whether they mistook your silence for a lack of love. These are difficult questions, but they are honest questions. And sometimes honest questions are the beginning of healing. Maybe your connection was never meant to be understood all at once. Maybe it needed time. Maybe both of you needed experiences outside the connection. Maybe both of you needed to grow. Maybe there were lessons that could only be learned separately. And maybe now you are both reaching a point where the past can finally be understood without carrying all of its old confusion. That does not mean everything must immediately return to the way it was. It does not mean every unanswered question suddenly disappears. It does not mean the future is guaranteed. It simply means the truth has become visible. And truth changes things. Your soulmate may be realizing that they do not need to invent a perfect story about you. They only need to acknowledge what actually happened. You were there, you cared, you tried, You protected what mattered to you, and perhaps, in ways you never expected, you protected them too. That is why this discovery feels so emotional, because they are not just discovering something you did, they are discovering something about who you were. They are realizing that the person they thought they knew was more complicated, more thoughtful, and perhaps more selfless than they understood. They may be thinking, how did I not see this? How could I have missed it? Why didn't they tell me? And maybe the answer is simple, because you did not want anything in return. You were not trying to make them feel indebted. You were not trying to create a dramatic moment. You were not waiting for a reward. You simply made a choice, and sometimes the most meaningful acts are the ones nobody sees. That may be why your soulmate feels emotional now. They have finally seen what was hidden. They have finally noticed the pattern. They have finally connected the dots. And once someone sees a pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. Every old memory becomes another piece. Every strange coincidence becomes something they want to understand. Every unanswered question becomes more important. Every moment of distance becomes something they want to revisit. They may even be looking through old conversations, not necessarily searching for something dramatic. Just looking, reading between the lines, remembering the tone, remembering what was happening around that time, trying to understand what you may have been feeling, trying to understand what you knew, trying to understand why you made the choices you made, and perhaps they are beginning to feel something they have avoided for a long time: gratitude. Not the casual kind, the deep kind, the kind that makes someone pause and realize, you cared about me even when I didn't understand you. That realization can change a person's heart. Maybe they are not ready to say it yet. Maybe they do not know how. Maybe pride is still in the way. Maybe fear is still stronger than courage. But something has shifted, and that shift began last night. Your soulmate found evidence that their story about you was incomplete, evidence that the distance between you may have contained more love than either of you understood, evidence that some of your hardest choices may have been made with their well-being in mind, evidence that perhaps, all along, you were quietly trying to keep something precious from being damaged. And now they are asking whether that precious thing was your connection. Maybe it was. Maybe it was the trust between you. Maybe it was their future. Maybe it was your own peace. Maybe it was something neither of you had words for. But whatever it was, they are beginning to see it, and they cannot simply forget what they discovered. There is another reason this moment may feel so intense, because your soulmate may have realized that you never truly needed them to validate what you did. You kept moving, you continued living, you learned, you grew, you became stronger, and while you were doing that, they were carrying their own questions. Now, suddenly, the answers are appearing. This is the kind of moment when someone realizes that the past does not always tell the truth on the first reading. Sometimes you need distance to understand what was happening. Sometimes you need maturity. Sometimes you need to experience enough life to recognize the value of what you once overlooked. Your soulmate may finally have that perspective. They may understand why you said certain things, why you held certain boundaries, why you refused to participate in certain situations, why you walked away when staying would have been easier, why you chose silence instead of creating conflict, why you protected your peace, and perhaps why, despite everything, you never completely stopped caring. This does not mean you were perfect. It means you were human, and being human means sometimes loving someone while still needing distance, sometimes caring while being unable to stay, sometimes wanting to explain everything but knowing that an explanation given at the wrong time will not be heard. Sometimes choosing the difficult path because the easy path would cause more damage. Your soulmate may now understand that, and understanding can be more powerful than any apology. They may be thinking about what they would say if you were standing in front of them. Maybe they would say, "I finally understand." Maybe, "I was wrong about you." Maybe, "I should have listened." Maybe, "Thank you." Maybe they do not have the words yet. Maybe they simply want to hear your voice. Maybe they want to know whether you are okay. Maybe they want to know whether you ever think about them. Maybe they want to know whether there is still a door open. But before they can ask any of those questions, they have to overcome one thing: fear, fear of rejection, fear of embarrassment, fear that you will not believe them, fear that you have already healed, fear that they waited too long, fear that the person who once cared has learned how to live without them, and perhaps that fear is exactly why they have been silent. But silence does not always mean a lack of feeling. Sometimes silence means someone is trying to figure out how to say something that matters. Last night may have forced them to confront that. They can no longer pretend that the discovery means nothing. They can no longer easily dismiss the possibility that you were protecting them. They can no longer tell themselves that you simply did not care. Because now they have evidence, and evidence changes the conversation. They may still be cautious. They may still question things, but the certainty they once had about you has been replaced by curiosity, and curiosity can lead to communication. It can lead to honesty. It can lead to a conversation that should have happened a long time ago. Maybe not immediately, maybe not dramatically, maybe it begins with something simple. "Hey, how have you been? I was thinking about you. I found something. There is something I need to tell you." Sometimes life-changing conversations begin with ordinary words. You may not even realize how much courage it takes for someone to send those words, because behind them can be months or years of thought. Behind them can be regret. Behind them can be hope. Behind them can be the fear of hearing nothing back. Your soulmate may be standing at that emotional crossroads now. One part of them wants to move toward you. Another part wants to protect itself. That internal conflict can be intense. But one thing has changed: they know more than they knew yesterday. And knowledge has a way of making old feelings impossible to ignore, maybe. This discovery also explains why you felt something strange recently. Maybe you sensed that something was changing. Maybe you suddenly remembered them. Maybe an old memory appeared unexpectedly. Maybe you found yourself thinking about a conversation from the past. Maybe you wondered what they were doing. That does not necessarily mean some supernatural force is controlling your thoughts. Sometimes people who mattered deeply to us remain psychologically significant long after we stop speaking. Memory is powerful. emotion is powerful, and unfinished conversations have a way of returning to our minds. So if you are reading this and feeling a strange sense of recognition, perhaps the message is not that you must wait for a miracle. Perhaps the message is simpler. There may be a truth about your past that deserves to be understood clearly. There may be something you did for someone that they never fully recognized. There may be something someone did for you that you did not appreciate until later, and sometimes understanding that truth is enough to bring peace. Whether your soulmate reaches out or not, the meaning of your choices does not disappear. If you protected someone because you genuinely cared, that mattered. If you stepped away because you knew the situation was unhealthy, that mattered. If you stayed silent because you were trying to avoid making things worse, that mattered. If you chose patience instead of revenge, that mattered. If you walked away while still caring, that mattered. Not every act of love is rewarded with a reunion. Not every connection returns in exactly the form we imagined. But that does not make the love meaningless. Sometimes love teaches, sometimes it protects, sometimes it transforms. Sometimes it helps us become the person we needed to become, and perhaps that is what this discovery is really about, not simply your